The desert wind still clung to her uniform when Sergeant Harrison's finger jabbed toward her face, his voice cracking like a whip across the courtyard. "You do not walk into that room, Captain. Not today. Not after what you did." Behind the glass door marked Debrief Room, authorized personnel only, a 3-star general was already holding a folder with her name on it. She had not given it to him. She did not know how it got there. And in that single, suspended second, she understood that something far bigger than her career was about to unravel. Before I tell you what happened next, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I love knowing who's listening. Her name was Captain Renata Martinez, and 3 days earlier she had been the last living voice in a convoy that should never have existed. She had walked out of the mountains with dust in her hair and blood that wasn't hers dried along her collar, carrying a folder stamped classified against her chest like it was the only thing keeping her upright. She had not slept. She had not called her mother. She had done exactly one thing since crossing back into friendly lines. She had held onto that folder as if it were a heartbeat. Sergeant Harrison had known her for 6 years. He had trained her as a green lieutenant who flinched at gunfire on the range. He had watched her become someone soldiers followed without being ordered to. And now he stood in front of her like a wall of granite, his hat casting a hard line of shadow across a face twisted somewhere between fury and fear. "You went outside the chain," he said, quieter now, almost pleading. "You know what that means." She did know. She had known it the moment she made the call from a dead man's radio, patched through 3 frequencies to a voice she'd never met, because the men above her, the ones who were supposed to authorize the extraction, the ones who were supposed to protect the 11 soldiers pinned in that ravine, had gone silent for 6 minutes too long. 6 minutes. In 6 minutes, a life can end twice over. She had made a choice that no manual could defend and no medal could excuse. She had gone around them, and she had lived to answer for it. The soldiers behind her had gone still, the kind of stillness that isn't calm but held breath. Nobody moved. Somewhere down the line, a boot scraped against concrete, too loud in the silence. The flag above them cracked once in the wind, sharp as a gunshot, and 3 soldiers flinched before they caught themselves. She thought she would be walking into that room a hero. She was wrong. Through the glass, she could see them. The officers seated at the long table, coffee going cold, the wall behind them lit with a map of coordinates she recognized in her bones because she had bled beside every one of them. And at the head of the table sat General Whitfield, silver-haired, unreadable, holding a manila folder that had her name stenciled across the front in block letters. Capt. R. Martinez, mission report. She had not written that copy. She had not filed it. As far as she knew, the only report that existed was the one crushed under her own arm, ink still damp from where her hands had shaken while writing it in a supply truck at 2 in the morning. So how was it already on his table? For a moment, doubt curled cold through her chest, colder than the mountain air had ever been. Had someone gotten to it first? Twisted her words, reshaped her decision into a confession before she'd even had the chance to explain it herself? Was she about to walk into that room and discover that the story of what she'd done no longer belonged to her? Harrison's hand dropped from pointing to gripping her shoulder, not gentle, not cruel. The grip of a man trying to hold someone back from a fire he genuinely believed would burn her. "Let them call you in," he said. "Don't force your way to a verdict you haven't even heard yet." It was the closest thing to kindness he knew how to offer, wrapped in the only language he had, command. She looked past him, through the glass, at the keypad blinking red beside the door. A small mechanical eye that would not open for her rank, not today. And she understood, with a clarity that settled somewhere beneath her fear, that this door was never just a door. It was the line between a soldier who followed orders and a soldier who had decided that 11 lives were worth more than her own career. She had crossed that line once already, in the ravine, when she picked up that dead man's radio. She was not going to pretend she regretted it now, even locked outside a room with her name already inside it. The debate had been quiet, almost polite, that morning inside that room, long before she'd arrived. A colonel with tired eyes had argued that unauthorized communication during an active operation was, by definition, a breach worth punishing. Regulations existed because chaos took root the moment individuals began deciding for themselves which orders to honor. Another officer, younger, had countered that 11 soldiers were alive today because one captain refused to wait for permission to save them, and that no rulebook was worth more than the men and women it was meant to protect. Nobody in that room was wrong. That was the terrible, honest truth of it. And it was General Whitfield's decision alone to weigh a soldier's courage against the very order that made an army rather than 11,000 individual wills pulling in 11,000 directions. Outside, Martinez felt the folder against her ribs, damp now with her own sweat, and thought of the 11 names she could still recite without looking. Private Dawson, 20 years old, who had cried when she found him but was breathing. Sergeant Ibarra, whose leg she'd splinted with a rifle strap. The others, whose faces she would carry long after this uniform came off for good. Whenever that day came. She had not broken protocol to be brave. She had broken it because the alternative was standing still while people she loved bled out in the dark. If that made her guilty of something, she decided, standing there with Harrison's hand still heavy on her shoulder, then she would rather be guilty and alive with that choice than obedient and haunted by 11 empty chairs. The keypad blinked red once more. Then, without warning, it turned green. The door didn't open on its own, it never does, not really. It opened because inside that room, General Whitfield set the folder down, looked toward the glass, and gave a single nod to the aide seated nearest the panel. It opened because somewhere in the last 6 minutes, the argument inside that room had tipped, not toward punishment but toward understanding. It opened because 11 letters, handwritten, unpolished, sent by soldiers who owed her their lives and had mailed their own accounts of that night before she'd even made it back to base, had reached the general's desk 2 days before she had. That was the folder on the table. Not a confession written against her. A defense written for her by the very people she thought she'd been protecting alone. Harrison's hand fell away from her shoulder. He said nothing, but something in his jaw loosened, the anger draining out of him like water finding its level. He had not been trying to stop her from facing judgment. He had been trying to stop her from walking into what he believed, until that very second, might be the end of everything she'd worked for. When the door clicked open and the cool air of the debrief room spilled out to meet her, he stepped aside without a word, and in his eyes was something close to pride, worn rough with years of never quite knowing how to show it. She walked through that doorway not as someone waiting for a verdict, but as someone finally allowed to finish a story that 11 other voices had already begun telling in her absence. General Whitfield rose halfway from his chair, folder still in hand, and said only, "Sit down, Captain. We've read what they had to say. Now we'd like to hear it from you. Because kindness doesn't vanish. It waits, folded quietly into a stranger's handwriting, carried across mountains and silence and fear, until it finds its way back to the very person who gave it first." She had walked out of that ravine believing she was alone in what she'd done. She walked into that room and learned she never had been. That courage, once given freely, has a way of returning to the hand that offered it, long after that hand has stopped expecting anything back at all. If the story moved you even a little, tell me in the comments what you would have done in her place. Locked outside a door, unsure if the world on the other side saw you as a hero or a mistake. Share this with someone who needs a reminder that doing the right thing is rarely convenient, but it is almost always remembered. And if you want more stories like Renata's, stories of courage, quiet justice, and the people who refuse to look away when it matters most, subscribe and stay close. There's always another door about to open.